Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about traits for correctness by construction, which is quite a simple idea, but we think has some merit, and it is based on the continued collaboration that we have with INA, where we supervise a student of INA's called Tobias, and my colleague Marco, who works on the L42 programming language that a lot of this work is using, is also quite involved. So without any further ado, I want to introduce traits. Traits is an idea that was coming out about 15 years ago after people were exploring the various alternatives to inheritance or code reuse. It was well outlined in the paper by Stefan Ducasse, and Andrew Black was the supervisor of a lot of this work. And the way to think about it is you can group code to be reused into a set of methods. Some methods can be concrete or with implementation, and some of them can be abstract or without implementation. And that's it, a very simple concept. If you have met abstract classes in Java, that can be a good example of what a trait concept is. You can see on the right an example done in a Smalltalk extension from the same time when traits were proposed, where you can have a trait called tEmptiness that provides 5 methods. The 4 methods on the right, like isEmpty, nonEmpty, ifEmpty, ifNotEmpty, are implemented, and that's why it provides these methods, while the methods on the right, like size, are the methods that are just given as the signature without any body. You can then imagine many traits like this, and you can then even imagine combining them together to see what traits you can use to provide the method size, or what traits you can then use tEmptiness with that will then use those implementations of size. A lot of work around traits talks around the core operator called the sum or composition of the traits. This is going to tell you that if you have 2 traits, how to put the implemented and abstract methods together. There is obviously going to arise some conflicts, like for example, 2 traits may provide method isEmpty, in which case you may want to go into more detail and say, well, in this case, exclude the method isEmpty from the definition of the trait and use the one that is the other part of the sum. That would be called exclusion. You can do other various things. In the original paper, they talked about aliasing, where you can talk about how to associate one method and one trait with implementation in another trait. You can talk about overriding, and you can imagine a much richer calculus and basically dealing with this core composition of the traits. At the time, it was proposed as an alternative to inheritance as the way to provide more flexible code reuse, where in the inheritance setting there is an enforced hierarchy. As you would know, say in Java, you start with object and work your way down. There is work since then connecting up the importance of hierarchy to how the traits are used. But none of that is necessarily going to be important to what the idea is in this talk. Scala has a variation of traits, although I think there is certain differences as to how it interprets the original proposal. Rust has traits. The kind of differences we are talking about is some of them allow variables, which the original proposal didn't allow, etc., etc. But let's see what we can do with it. So I would like to explain my idea, propose these 2 differences. I do agree that these are a bit strawman, but it will be useful for the purposes of our discussion. Let's talk about post hoc verification, where you write a program, you write a specification, and then you need to provide a proof that the program meets your specification. It is arguably can be made quite complicated because you often write the code in relatively large chunks, not necessarily the whole program, but at least maybe perhaps at the level of individual methods or even slightly bigger than that. and then you have to work through being able to prove that the code meets your specification. So that's the post hoc verification. You wrote quite a bit of code and then you verify it. And then the second strawman, again, for the sake of example, I'll talk about is, the well-established in this group ideas of correctness by construction, refinement calculus, and other work, where the idea is to move towards more incremental steps of constructing program while maintaining the correctness that you start off with by providing the specification. Perhaps you can have a method where it will have the pre and post condition, and you will then slowly refine it until you get to the actual code through a set of what's called refinement rules. Often these are outside of the actual language, but they will guide you towards constructing a program that will always maintain the correctness given the specification by construction, hence the name. And then for this version of the strawman, we say, well, it may be a little bit more complex because you have to follow these refinement rules, and often this may not be part of the language. So what's our very, very, very simple idea is, well, knowing how the traits work and seeing how correctness by construction works, why not try to utilize concepts like traits to do traits for correctness by construction? The idea is that you can start off with a specification which will have just the abstract method with no body. And you can think of these abstract methods and traits as wholes that are then refined by introducing more and more concrete methods to fulfill the contract of the abstract methods every time you do that. You program in the language of traits incrementally, just like you would do in the correctness by construction, but it is all part of the same simple language. And it all comes down to how traits are composed. The composition of traits is going to be, for our case, relatively straightforward. I'll show it by an example to meet the existing specification and use the specification of a trait that you're introducing. But the flexibility that traits give you, we believe, provides a bit more of a balance between this difference of having to write quite a bit of code and then verify it, or working through the refinement rules outside of your language until you actually build up the code that is fully implemented and correct by construction. So that's the simple idea. So I'll give you an example, and we have a paper under submission that has a bit more of the proofs and evaluation of what we are doing. So here is an example. It's going to slowly build up a method that will work with a list and will find a maximum element in that list. So that's the specification. We demand to have at least one or more elements in the list. And as a result, we will ask for a result that is in the list. And for every element in the list, the result is going to be greater or equal than that element. And we initially have just an abstract method, max element without body, and that's our first trait. On its own, a valid trait is just an abstract method, and the specification is given. We then sit down and start to think about what we can do, and we write a second trait. We just call it max e trait 2, where we try to implement max element. We now give it a body. It becomes a concrete method that is going to be provided by this trait, and the body will basically do the following sequence of steps on lines 6 to 9, where if list is just a singleton element, it will call out to access element. That is an abstract method that we don't need to worry about defining. It will have a specification that, hey, if you have more than one or more elements in the list, the result will be the actual element in the list. Of course, for our case, we do it for the list of size 1, so that's just going to need to access the element in the list, perhaps the head, and that's it. If you then have size that is more than 1, then you can use max element that you're defining to find the max element in the tail of the list, compare it with the element that is the head of the list, and decide to access it if it's bigger than all of the other elements. Or alternatively, use a max tail to work through the tail of the list to find the maximum element there. And again, max tail is an abstract trait that is defined with the conditions on lines 15 to 17, which assumes the list size stays strictly greater than 1. And the outcome is that if the either the results the outcome is going to be is that results are going to be in the tail of the list, and for all of the contents of the tail of the list, because that's what we're working with, the result is going to be greater than all of the elements in there. So it's the maximum in the tail. So here's the trait. One method is implemented and two are abstract. We then do one more trait, working through the access element, where the implementation can be just returning the head of the list, the element itself. And we can do final one more trait. This is a bit of an interesting one, which implements max tail. It provides the implementation of max tail by simply calling max element on the tail of the list. And look, it's going to provide an abstract method, max element. Remember, that's the one we are defining to begin with, which is given the list will return the maximum element in that list using the same pre and post condition as we used in the trait 1. And now you can see that just like with the work on traits, we can use the mechanisms provided by trait composition to put all 4 of these traits together, and the result is going to be the combination of the 4 traits that gives you a full implementation of the max element that is fully complete if you flatten it out and provide the concrete implementations of every method. So what we've went through just now is basically a correctness by construction kind of process, but we fully used the traits and the trait composition operations in the language itself rather than something external to the language. So if you give me a language with traits, which can be variations of Smalltalk people did, or even if properly done extensions of Scala or Rust, you can get this mechanism for free, and thus we hope it would make it easier to get programmers to use correctness by construction approach using the language mechanisms they're perhaps used to. To further demonstrate the example and the power of using traits, sorry for skipping the slide earlier, consider you want to implement a minimum element now. Well, here is an implementation of the minimum element. You'll write it as a trait, which all it will need to do this time is to compare the elements to the rest of the list, which will have perhaps the min element calling out to the tail, and every single result will be compared with elements in the list and make sure it's the least one, the smallest one. And the only thing in this min implementation that is an abstract method is access element. But guess what? This access element is provided by one of our traits before, I think the third one. So by combining this trait min-e with the third one, you'll get a full implementation of the minimum element. So we think it's quite a nice way of providing reuse in the language. We wouldn't go into much detail in terms of how our composition works, because we just did a very straightforward composition for this first example. You can see that if you have a method with a body over here, and then the method without the body, and those are composed together to produce a method which meets the agreed specification of the original method with the body, you then ensure that the precondition of the method that you're combining with, the method that you're implementing, the abstract one, implies the precondition of the concrete method that we're providing, and similarly the postcondition of the concrete method implies the relevant postcondition of the abstract method. And that's it. That is straightforward substitution, and then you accept it as the valid combination, a composition of the concrete and an abstract method. You can then have similar things for combining the specifications of the two abstract methods. So depending on which way around are they going to fit within, you either pick the composition of the first or the second method. And similarly with the bodies that you have involved, you allow the actual sum composition to be fully associative, not associative, commutative, sorry. So nothing complicated there. There is future work, obviously, that you can extend in terms of the interesting composition of the specification that you can do here. We are also basing this in terms of implementation plans on some of the GML work that Gary Evans and others have been doing since, with the support for some of the abstract classes of Java 8 that may help our progress. But in general, it is no more than this simple idea that, hey, why don't we utilize traits or abstract classes to make it easier for programmers to follow correctness by construction approach. And as far as the proofs are concerned, again, they're quite straightforward. Once we have these very simple combinations of specifications, we simply say that if you have this fully abstract specification and the refinement steps, which are going to be the compositions of these traits, then once you actually construct a program that has all of these traits combined together, or flattened if you like, then the resulting program will have a well-typed body and it will meet the original specifications. Again, something you would expect. We do discuss a little bit of trade-offs as sort of the main contribution of the paper, and like I said, it's a bit of a strawman in terms of how it combines the comparison between the post hoc verification versus the classic construction, correctness by construction. There is this, we think, an advantage of having the language of traits being used in the middle here with the necessary specification language, rather than having the refinement rules not being part of what programmer is used to with the language. We generally, I think, make it easier for the tools to work because we can reuse the existing verification tools. Our process is to use a little bit of a type checker for the traits, but then underneath it all, we can use a verifier. In our work, because of Ina's familiarity with key, we're planning to go down to key verifier, but you can imagine that you can use, like I said before, the GML tools and other toolkits available to us. We think it's a bit easier to debug a program like that because it is part of the same language. And the granularity of the proofs can be up to you. You can write manually a very simple, very complicated method in a trait, and then as long as you worked your way through proving that it meets the specification, you leave it and you can then reuse it because it just becomes one of the concrete methods in many traits in the system. Or you can choose to make the traits methods quite simple, and it's totally up to you. It's part of the language. And then once verified, that method can be reused in a trait, so we think that's quite a big benefit. So that's the simple idea that we had, and we hope to get some comments from you and happy to discuss it at a later point. Thank you very much.